Hey, it's Andrew from the future with a very important update. So this video is going to be a little weird. So far, the process of upgrading from v15 of React to v16 of React has been painless. That's because I built a course alongside of the beta and release candidate versions of React 16. So everything is completely compatible. Switching required us to just switch version numbers. So here's the catch. In this video, we're going to explore a new tool called Enzyme. Enzyme supports both v15 and v16 of React, but in order to get v16 support, we also have to upgrade our Enzyme version, and that requires a few additional lines of configuration. So I'm going to be jumping in about 3 or 4 times throughout the video to point out things that you are going to need to do to get everything working when you're using React 16 and the new version of Enzyme, which is Enzyme 3. Now, if you run into any problems with this video, as always, just reach out. And I understand that this video is not ideal. All of the videos before have been smooth sailing and all the ones after will be too. This is the one video that does require a few extra edits in order to get you upgraded to the latest version of all of those libraries. So let's go ahead and jump right in. The reason that I didn't pull up the documentation for React Test Renderer is that there basically is none. It's not a very complex utility. We literally used almost all of the features. We create a new renderer, we render something to it, and then we get the rendered output. There's not a heck of a lot that goes into using React Test Renderer. Now that's a problem for us because we do have more complex things we want to test as well. For example, later on, we're going to want to click buttons, we're going to want to change inputs, we're going to want to search the rendered output for a specific element and grab its text. All of these things are going to be really difficult to do with React Test Renderer, which is why we're really not going to use it. Instead, we're going to be using a library called Enzyme that was released by Airbnb. Enzyme is a renderer for React, but it is a much more full-featured renderer. React Test Renderer was always designed to be a very simple utility for rendering, and Enzyme does use it. Enzyme, though, comes with a lot of great features for people actually writing test cases. So we're going to go ahead and install that and explore it, and we're also going to see how we can use Enzyme to shallow render header and create a snapshot from it. Then we'll have everything set up and we can really start making some progress on testing these components. So step 1 is going to be to install the new tool. I'm going to go ahead and shut down the test suite, and I will use yarn add to add it. That is Enzyme at the latest version 2.9.1. Andrew from the future with the first of a few interruptions, and this is by far the longest one. So we're not going to be installing Enzyme version 2. Instead, we're going to use yarn add Enzyme at 3.0.0. Now, it's no longer just enough to install Enzyme. With version 2, everything else we needed was built into the core library. With version 3, there are a few other things we need. The first one is going to be an adapter. So let's write it out first. It is Enzyme hyphen adapter hyphen React hyphen 16. So with v3 of Enzyme comes the idea of an adapter. It allows us to specify exactly which version of React we want to test against. This allows the core Enzyme library to be a whole lot smaller. It doesn't need to have all of the code for all of the various versions of React that are supported. Instead, you just specify which one you need by installing the adapter. That keeps the core library light, and it keeps your entire code base a little more manageable. So there is a version for v15 if we wanted to use Enzyme 3 with React 15. We are going to stick with version 16 though, since that's the version of React we're using, and we're going to install it at 1.0.0. Now there is one more module we need, so we're going to put a space right here, and this one is a polyfill for a browser feature known as request animation frame. This is something that's provided by your browsers, and when we don't have it in this testing environment, it does cause some issues. So all we're going to do is install and set up something called RAF, which is just short for request animation frame, and the version that we're going to be using at 3.3.2. We're barely going to use RAF at all. We're really just going to specify it one time, same thing with the adapter. So let's go ahead and actually run this command that's going to install those 3 libraries. And once we have them in our project, we're going to go through the process of setting up the additional configuration required with Enzyme 3 that we didn't need with Enzyme 2. Everything installed correctly, so let's clear the output and get to that. The first thing I'd like to do is create a setup tests file in our project, and this is going to be something that allows us to configure our test environment. This is where we're going to be able to set up the enzyme adapter, and we'll just do it once in this setup file as opposed to doing it every single time we use Enzyme. To get that done, we're going to create a file now that you'll end up creating later in the course for unrelated reasons. This is going to sit in the source tests directory, and we are going to call this one setup tests.js. This is going to be a file that runs that allows us to configure the environment we're running in. And all we're going to do is import Enzyme, the enzyme adapter, and we're going to call a single method to actually wire up Enzyme to work with the adapter. So we're just going to write these 3 lines once, and we'll never come back to them ever again. Right here, we'll start off by importing Enzyme, and we're going to grab the default export for this, and we're going to grab this from the Enzyme module. Down below, I am going to import adapter from, and then we're going to specify that module. That was enzyme -adapter -react -16. Then down below, we're going to go ahead and use a single method call to configure everything. That is enzyme.configure. Now, enzyme.configure can take all sorts of attributes. We are going to pass in as the first and only argument an object, and on this object we can specify various configuration properties. Adapter is pretty much the only one you're ever actually going to use, and we're going to set lowercase adapter equal to a new instance of the adapter we'd actually like to use. So that would be new adapter, calling it with no arguments. And there we have it. This is all we need for the setup tests file. Now, whenever we use Enzyme in our test cases, which we'll be doing in just a little bit, it will be adding support for v16 of React. There really isn't a whole lot more to say about this particular setup. You can find something very similar if you head over to the documentation. If we do go over to airbnb.io/enzyme, the documentation for the enzyme library, one of the first things they talk about is this upgrade path. And if you scroll down, they have the exact same code we just typed right there. So we just need to do this in order to get the library working. The next thing we're going to do is set up a jest configuration JSON file, which is going to allow us to actually specify that that setup tests file should run, because it's not like it's in a special location with a special name. It's not going to get picked up automatically. So let's take a look at the documentation for that. We're going to head over to the jest documentation. That's facebook.github.io/jest. And what we're looking for is the docs. And we're looking for the configuration docs. You can find that under the API reference, configuring jest. Now, there are a few different ways to do this. You can expose objects, you can add command line arguments, you can set up a JSON file. We're not going to worry about that. I'll talk about how to do that in just a second. What I want to bring you here to show you is the list of things you can customize with jest. Now, most of these are going to get you into some trouble if you don't know what you're doing. The one that we're going to be using down below is called setup files. Setup files is real easy to use. You specify an array of files, jest runs those files before it runs your tests, and this allows us to set things up, like the request animation frame polyfill and the setup tests file, which we just created. So we're going to go through the process of setting up a configuration JSON file right now, and I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code to get that done. Now, this file is going to live in the root of our project, so let me go ahead and collapse all directory trees, and right alongside of those root files, we're going to add another one. This one is going to be jest.config.json. Now, it is a JSON file, so we have to make sure to follow the valid JSON format. I'm going to start by opening and closing some curly braces. Then I'm going to specify the various things I want to configure. And as I just mentioned, we're going to be setting up just one that is going to be setup files. Now, this name is particular. It comes from the docs. If you use something else, it may or may not exist. So do refer to the documentation before you add stuff inside of here. Now, all we're going to do is set this equal to an array of paths to files that we want to have be our setup files. The first one is going to be the request animation frame polyfill, and the second one is going to be the JavaScript file that we just created and set up. The first string, using double quotes since this is a JSON file, is going to be RAF /polyfill. If you check out the RAF documentation, this is where you can grab the JavaScript file that's going to add the polyfill in. We're going to load that first, then we're going to load the file that we specified. That's the setup test file. And when we are adding file paths into this just config JSON file, we have to start off our relative paths, meaning to files that are actually in our project and not in node modules, with this syntax, the less than and greater than sign, in there, the keyword root dir, then everything after this comes from the root of the project. So in our case, we would go from the root of the project to /source/tests/setup tests.js. So this is going to make sure that the polyfill loads, then our setup tests file loads, then our test suite actually runs. Now I'm going to close down these two files, and there is just one more small change we have to make before we're ready to continue on. Inside of package.json, we have to change our jest command, telling it where it can find that config file, the one that we just created. All we have to do is specify the argument config, and we set it equal to the file name, jest.config.json. And there we have it. We now have everything set up with Enzyme 3, and we're going to be able to continue on using Enzyme in all of our test cases without needing to make any major changes. It's just this initial configuration that required a little bit of work. So now that we have all of this in place, we can go ahead and jump back into the regular video. I'm going to go ahead and add this dependency, and then I'm also going to go ahead and restart the test suite. So I'll kick off the test suite once again, and now we're going to explore exactly what Enzyme gives us. So Enzyme does have a lot to it, so I do want to make you aware of where the documentation lives on the web. There is a ton of features. Enzyme. If we Google Enzyme, it should bring us over to the Airbnb GitHub repository. This is exactly what we want. And from there, we should be able to click over to airbnb.io, where they have all of their technical stuff, /Enzyme. This is the big documentation page. Now, there is a guides and installation section. We're going to be going through all of that. What I do want to make you aware of, though, is the API reference, where you can find everything Enzyme has to offer. And once again, we're seeing those two different ways we can render things. We have shallow rendering, and we have full DOM rendering. For the moment, we're just going to stick with shallow rendering. So if we do click through, we're going to be able to see all of the methods we have available to us when we use shallow rendering. Now, what I'd like to do is just take a quick moment to explore some of the more common ones and how they're used. Then we're going to focus on creating a snapshot based off of Enzyme. So the first thing we need to do is import the named export shallow. This is the shallow renderer. So I'm going to go ahead and get that done. Importing shallow from Enzyme. Once we have that, we can remove the React test renderer import, and I'm also going to comment out all of the code that currently lives inside of the test case. And from here, we're actually going to shallow render header once again. Now, the process for getting this done is much easier. All we have to do is create a variable. It's commonly called wrapper. You're going to see wrapper littered throughout the documentation for Enzyme, and then we call shallow as a function. What do we pass into shallow? We pass in the JSX that we're trying to shallow render. So right here, I can create an instance of header. Perfect. Now that we have the shallow rendered header, we have access to the full API that you're seeing over here. You can see right here, for example, they're using wrapper. We're going to stick to the same naming convention. One of the more popular ones that we can use is find. So if you're familiar with jQuery or document.querySelectorAll, this is going to allow us to select the various elements inside of our component and make assertions about them. So we can go ahead and mess around with that real quick. For example, I can expect something about wrapper. I'm going to use find, and find works just like those other methods I mentioned. We pass in the selector, so I could select something by ID, the ID of test. I could select something by class, a class of button, or I can select something by its element tag like H1. And then I could do something like grab the length, and I can assert that the length is 1, expecting the length to be 1. Now, if I go ahead and save the header test file over inside of the test suite, what do we get? We get that we have one obsolete snapshot, which is fine, but all of our test cases are indeed passing. So if we did have more than one H1 or less than one H1, the test case would indeed fail. Now we could also do something interesting like grab the text value off of that H1 using the text method. Now we're going to be able to make an assertion about the text value of that H1. If I save the file in its current state, obviously things fail. The text value is Expensify and we are still checking it to be 1. So all we have to do is change that over to Expensify, and then the test case is going to pass. So using the just very basics of Enzyme, we're able to get a lot of cool things done, and we're able to really dive into our component and make assertions about the things inside. Now back to the docs real quick. The two methods that we just used, one was find, that is sitting right here. We pass in the selector and we get a wrapper back. The other one down below is text. Text returns the text of whatever you're looking at. In our case, we found the H1 and we got its text node. We could do the same thing for a button, a paragraph tag, or any other element. So now that we know that we can use Enzyme like this, we are going to go ahead and comment out this line. We don't actually want to add this to the header test, but I did want to give you a little taste of what Enzyme can do to justify switching from React Test Renderer over to Enzyme. With Enzyme, we get a much more full-featured, user-friendly API. Now the goal is to actually create a snapshot based off of the Enzyme wrapper. I'm going to expect the wrapper to match snapshot. Now, obviously, we are going to need to save this file. And what's going to happen over inside of the test suite, we're going to notice that we are getting a updated snapshot. So we're going to go ahead and for the moment, just accept this update as it is. Now let's take a look at exactly what we just saved. So over here, what we're getting is an instance of shallow wrapper from Enzyme. And if we scroll down, we can see there does seem to be some stuff related to the rendered output, but there's also a lot of stuff related to the internals of the Enzyme library. So if any of these internals were to change, the snapshot would change and our tests would start failing. So this is not what we want. We don't want all of this junk on there. What we really want is just the rendered output. Now, to make Enzyme work with the snapshot testing functionality, there is one little utility library we have to install. If we head over to the browser, we can take a quick peek at that. This is Enzyme 2 JSON, and it allows us to get that JSON back, what we saw in the last video, what comes back from react.createElement, and there really is not a whole lot to this. It exports a single function, and we use that single function. Right here you can see we grab toJSON, and all we do is use toJSON when we are expecting something about our Enzyme wrapper. So I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing they just showed here. Step 1, let's switch over to the terminal, shut things down and install that library, yarn add enzyme to JSON at 1.5.1. Hey, it's Andrew from the future. This is a quick one. Make sure to install Enzyme to JSON version 3.0.1. This does support Enzyme 3, which is what we're using. There's no change to the API, so the setup is going to be exactly the same. You just need to install the newer version. All right, let's get back to the video. Once we have it installed, we are going to restart the test suite. Then we'll actually be able to use the function we just imported. All right, test suite is up and running. Let's go ahead and kick things off. I'm going to import toJSON from Enzyme to JSON. Then I'm going to go ahead and actually use it. So right here, toJSON. And all I do is pass the Enzyme wrapper in. toJSON is going to take the wrapper. It is going to extract just the meaningful stuff, the rendered output. And now if we save things, yes, our snapshot is going to fail because they're different. But if we hit U and look at the new one, it's now what we want. It's what we had before. So using this library, we're able to get those correct snapshots showing up in the snapshot file. And now that we have this in place, Enzyme is all set up. We're actually going to be able to create as many of these snapshot tests as we like. There is one more little piece of configuration we can do though. We can actually set up Enzyme to JSON to work automatically so we don't have to add it into our code. And that is what I would like to wrap this video up by doing. Hey, it's Andrew from the future for the last time. We're about to create the jest.config.json file, but you already have that since it is necessary to get Enzyme 3 even working at all. That's where we set up the startup files. What we're going to do in the next couple of minutes is to set up another property called snapshot serializers. All you're going to do is add that on to your existing JSON file. There's no need to create a new file, it already exists, and there's no need to wire it up in package.json again since you've already done that with the config argument. All right, let's go ahead and jump right back in. I'm going to create a brand new file, and we're actually going to save this in the root of the project. So right alongside of our other config files, and we can call this whatever we like. I'm going to call it jest.config.json. And this is indeed a JSON file, so I'll start with my curly braces. And there is just a single property that we need to define to have it automatically use the Enzyme to JSON serializer. That is right here, snapshot serializers. Now, when we set up snapshot serializers, we pass in an array of those serializers, and we have the one we installed. It is a string value that gets put in this array, Enzyme to JSON/serializer. Now, you can actually look at the Enzyme to JSON documentation, and they tell you to do this exact same thing. So this is where this code comes from. Now, we have this set up, but this file name isn't anything special. Jest isn't automatically going to be using it. What we have to do is modify our command just slightly. So what I am going to do is make a quick tweak in package.json. We can provide the path to that config file using --config. We set this equal to the file name. Ours was jest.config.json. And now every single time we run jest, it is going to bootstrap based off of that configuration file. So I'm going to go ahead and save package.json and shut it down. Also make sure to save your jest config file and shut that down. Then we can restart the test suite. I'm going to shut it down, run yarn test once again. This time it is going to grab that config file. And what's the end result? The end result is the exact same thing, but now we can actually remove this stuff. So I can remove the import. I can remove the call to JSON, just passing the wrapper in directly, and everything is still going to work. I save the file, and we don't get any error about the snapshot. So it is still grabbing just the rendered output. So this is the configuration that we're going to be working with throughout the rest of the section. Now that everything is set up, we can actually make some meaningful progress on testing the components. That's going to be the topic of the next video, so stay tuned, and I'll see you then.